Don't worry. We will want to be out of here the moment it's over. So we'll.
Yeah, actually,
So what are the rules?
Well, we're still waiting for one more person.
Yeah, and now the panel that was Marie, who's obviously not going to be there. Me,
Oh, so it's you and Mark.
So I guess
All right.
Suspense or something?
Mark.
You guys can. Yeah. You can fill an hour, really.
Oh. A hush falls over.
Look at this. You guys just spontaneously fell silent on time. You are so well trained. As everybody knows, that authors always follow every rule and they always cooperate. And an evil spell has apparently hit one of our panel members, and so they have been whisked off to Mordor or whatever fantasy you read. So we will carry and do the best that we can. In the tradition of, you saw that on your Eventbrite, the schedule and all the numerous panels that 20Books is having, and in its traditional thing, 20Books gave us this micro-specific, ultra-niche panel called Fantasy. So we'll be talking about fantasy. I am Kevin J. Anderson. I'm your moderator. And as all moderators punt the first question, we will just pass it down to Dan and have everybody introduce themselves and tell their greatest, deepest, darkest fantasy. Oh, no. No, just that's a different panel. That's after hours.
Vegas, but it's still a different panel.
Yeah, appropriate, but after hours. Right now, just tell us you're writing some of your works and why you're on the fantasy panel.
I guess I'm Dan Holmberg, DK Holmberg. I've been independently published since 2012, and I think I'm here because I've been doing this for a decade now and have had some moderate success, and glad to be here.
Okay. I'm Rebecca Moesta. I'm probably most well known for writing Young Jedi Knights 14 in the series with my husband, Kevin J. Anderson. I've also written fantasy and horror humor. I wrote a Buffy the Vampire Slayer novel and a Crystal Doors trilogy, which is original, and I mostly write for middle grades and young adult science fiction or fantasy.
I'm Jonathan Maberry. I write in a lot of different genres, horror, science fiction, fantasy, thriller, and so on. Within fantasy, I write epic fantasy. I'm actually in the middle of a trilogy right now. I write dark fantasy and urban fantasy, and I also edit Weird Tales, which tends to draw on that. And a lot of the different fantasy elements, like sword and sorcery, were pretty much born in Weird Tales. The Lovecraftian stuff was born in Weird Tales, and that's definitely fantasy. So I have a lot my fingers in a lot of fantasy pies, which is a weird thing to say. It sounded better in my head, I'm just saying. Yeah. That was going to go south on me, I know, but it's early. Coffee hasn't kicked in. And I love reading and writing fantasy, and I love adding fantasy elements to other types of genres that I'm working in, and to entertain myself and to also surprise and entertain readers.
And I'm Kevin J. Anderson, and I have written many books in all kinds of genres, science fiction and horror and mystery and suspense, and also lots of fantasies, and that includes urban fantasies and dark fantasies. And I have committed, I think, 6 trilogies. And in fact, my latest one just came out last January, was the 3rd book, and they're all giant doorstop books called the Wake the Dragon trilogy. But if you get right down to it, like, all fiction is fantasy. I mean, everything that you're writing is something that's made up, if it's a story. So and in the genre of fantasy, as Jonathan mentioned a bit, that there are lots of different subgenres, and there's the urban fantasy and fantasy romance and dark fantasy, and lit RPG is very often fantasy. Post-apocalyptic can be fantasy. We found out after reading numerous books of Terry Brooks's Shannara series that, that's post-apocalyptic. So there's all kinds of fantasy, and there's sword and sorcery. For the purposes of this panel, we're going to kind of start out with what I would call kind of generic fantasy, as in big epic fantasy, Lord of the Rings kind, or sword and sorcery, or just spells and dragons and that kind of stuff. And I'm going to punt over to Jonathan because I want you to define to these people, tell them what sword and sorcery is, because you've kind of just jumped right back into it.
True, I'm writing sword and sorcery. And also, the very first book I ever bought with my own money was Conan the Wanderer, which was sword and sorcery. Sword and sorcery is usually epic-based. There is swordplay. There's a lot of violence in it. It is different in substantial ways from later variations like high and epic fantasy, though they often include swords and sorcery elements to it. But the sword and sorcery story tends to be a little grittier, has a little more of an edge, and that's pun intended. And the sorcery elements are often dark, not always, but often dark. And the thing that I like about it is you can enter those stories from a lot of different angles. The Conan stories, if you've ever read the original Conan stories, he's not a good guy. He is a better guy than some of the people he's fighting, but he's a thief, he's a conqueror, he's not a great guy, but he is the heroic center of the story, My favorites were the Cain stories by Karl Edward Wagner, where he is actually the villain of most of his stories, except when there's someone more villainous than him. And sword and sorcery has the elements of adventure as probably its centerpiece, with the swordplay being necessary because we need violence to happen, because violence in fiction is fun. And we want the sorcery there because we don't want it to be basically a sword and sandal, a variation of a sword and sandal drama, like a historical Roman gladiator story. So it has to have those elements of weird to make it sword and sorcery.
And I'm going to jump down further because Rebecca writes young adult fantasy. And can you tell us a little more about young adult, maybe Pretty In or some of the other things as what constitutes a young adult fantasy? No, that didn't come out right either, did it?
No. I write in young adult fantasy because that's what got me to really, really love reading. I started out with fairy tales and then moved to juvenile science fiction, and then got into a bunch of the fantasies like C.S. Lewis and Lloyd Alexander, who wrote the Chronicles of Pretty In. And the reason I like those particularly is because the protagonists are usually young, and usually teens or slightly ahead of that, or they can start like when they're 11 and find their powers, and then you follow them along. But the key is that something changes them. They're bumping into something that's brand new to them. And you watch how they deal with these brand new situations, and having the fantasy to mix into that is just really exciting to me.
And I should also mention for all of you that today is Rebecca's birthday.
Yay for being alive.
Yeah. And her fantasy was she wanted to be on a big panel at 20Books on her birthday. So there we go. She's got it. So I guess I should have mentioned at the beginning, for this panel, we're going to kind of talk about the genre and defining it, and we're going to talk some craft discussions of things, but we're also going to talk about the business end and fantasy for indie writers and indie publishers and how the genre has changed. And I'm going to go down to Dan for a little bit, because Jonathan and I grew up in traditional publishing, and it was just like the defined fantasy cliche was you wrote a trilogy. It always had to be a trilogy. And in fact, people got sick of people writing trilogies all the time. And it was always a trilogy. But with indie publishing, that's completely different. And series may be the better thing to do. And in fact, I was thinking when you were describing Sword and Sorcery lends itself more toward a series. It's Conan fights the monster of the week, and a trilogy is different. So go.
When I started the Kagan the Damned series, I had every intention of it being a series, And then and my editor was all about that. And then the publisher said, so what's the third book in the trilogy? And I was like, no, it's a series. And she wrote back, what period is period, the period, third period book in the trilogy, 3 exclamation points. Traditional publishing.
So write the first 3 books in the series, and then when it becomes, then you write a sequel trilogy. Another 3.
That's my evil master plan.
Of course. So, so Dan, because I guess you're doing mostly series. So can you talk about it, and then we'll kind of go all the way through, because we've all, Rebecca as well, we've all got experience in the very clearly defined traditional publishing route of doing fantasy trilogies and books. And because a lot of you little kids out there don't know about trad publishing, we'll describe some of that. Dan.
Well, yeah, so I grew up reading all traditionally published works, and so like everybody, I'm sure, you read Lord of the Rings, and that was a trilogy. But then what really got me into fantasy was the Robert Jordan, The Wheel of Time series, and that was a true series. It wasn't a trilogy. And so when I came into publishing, I wasn't locked into the mindset of it needed to be a trilogy. But I did still structure my first fantasy series as a trilogy, thinking, well, if it doesn't do well, I can end it, or I can continue it if it keeps doing well. And so like my first series was called the Cloud Warrior Saga, and it was structured as 3 books with an overarching arc with it, but it was left open. And so it really ended up as 11-book series, but it was multiple trilogies and then a quadrology, I guess, at the end of it. So I think the trilogy structure still stays with fantasy, although later series that I've done, I've kind of gotten away from that because I know that I can push a series and I don't have to worry about whether it's going to succeed and whether readers are going to follow it. So I don't follow that quite as much, but I think having some series arcs where you can kind of have an endpoint, and that's something that's nice with indie publishing, is knowing that you can go in and say, okay, I can stop this if it's not selling and I can move on to something else, or I can keep writing if it is doing well and give my readers more of what they want is very useful. And so I always think about that going into starting a new project is there a defined endpoint that I can add? And if not, how long am I willing to commit to something if it's not selling the way that I want? And that's important for me because I write my entire series before I release it. So I've got, lots of books that are backlogged right now. And so, if I'm writing a 7-book series, I better be pretty confident that I can sell it because that's a pretty big time commitment at that point.
Wow. And just kind of as a point of order, which we often forget, The Lord of the Rings isn't really a trilogy. It's just one frickin' long book that they couldn't publish into one volume that was that long, so they kind of artificially broke it into that. So Tolkien was ahead of his time. He was looking for the KU page reads before it was even invented. But Rebecca, traditional publishing, trilogies, series, because Young Jedi Knights was a big, long series. And
Yes. Well, Young Jedi Knights is kind of space opera because it's Star Wars, but basically it's a fantasy with a science fiction backdrop. The science isn't really part of the story. It's not integral to the story. And when Kevin and I were asked to write some young adult Star Wars, they asked us to write 3, and we said, okay, and we did our plotting and got a really good arc going for 3 books, and turned in the first book, and they went, hey, this is good. We didn't know if that was a compliment, the surprise, but then they said, wait, just make it into 5 books. So we reworked the entire arc, and then after we finished that, they immediately asked us for more books, and so we did another
we did
5
6,
book, or
then
is it-
5, then 3.
Yeah, 6, then 5, then 3. So
So you ended on a trilogy.
what
Trilogy of stories.
what we did, though, is what I think a lot of you do when you write your series, is you have an arc, and it's kind of like braiding hair. You can feed in more and more things if you want. You can put in ribbon or tinsel, whatever you want to put in there, but you can...
You're kidding me.
Well, the sign says it's a hot mic down there, so it might be a... I guess we're supposed to leave.
All right.
Thank you all for the panel.
Oh, that sucked.
The source of the alarm signal that you have heard is being investigated. You will be notified when the source of the alarm is identified. Thank you.
Okay, let's give it a few minutes then.
I don't know. Talk through it.
May I have your attention, please? The source of the alarm signal that you have heard is being investigated.
As you were.
That's too funny.
All right.
Oh, nope. We gotta go.
Yes?
They said leave.
All right.
This was just getting interesting.
But I had all kinds of really trad stupidity to go over it. Well, her fantasy was a exciting panel for.
Actually, everybody in the hotel's gathering out.